Mikros verbinden.
So.
We are getting more chairs. Oh, right. No, it's because we can't see us.
Ach so, ja. Wir nehmen alle mit. We take everyone.
Shall we move?
No, it's fine. Just
So.
Ich warte nur auf. Komm. Sandy bringt ein paar Stühle, deshalb gibt es Krach.
The chairs keep coming.
Yeah, this is a performance, so this will happen in half an hour. So. Liebe Gäste, herzlich willkommen. Dear visitors, very warm welcome to you and to Jimmy Robert. The talk will be in English, so I will continue also in English. Now you are sitting in an installation, the entrance installation from the exhibition from Jimmy Robert, all dressed up and nowhere to go. I would recommend that before you start, you just take a second to get loose in this illusionary space where Jimmy Robert created with Studio Diogo Passarinho for this exhibition. The exhibition is going out from exactly all dressed up and nowhere to go and questions the performance and what remains, what is my body, who looks at the gaze with the body. So the creator, Christina Lehnert, who has created the exhibition with me and our curatorial assistant, Sandeep Sodhi, we have decided to do a kind of an introductory talk today. It's going to be a loose conversation. And Christina will ask some questions about how came to this brilliant exhibition, which I'm very proud of. So yesterday we had the opening, and today we have already you and many visitors, and already a very good critic in the newspaper, which I might say. So I give the microphone to my colleague Christina, and thank you again for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Çağla. Also ich spreche kurz in Deutsch. Oh no, we are a mixed audience, so I also continue in English. So from my side, also welcome back to the Kunsthalle. I think most of you have been here yesterday and seen the show, made a tour with either Jimmy and I, and got a first sense of his oeuvre, actually, that is being showing here from the last 20 years. Next to actually new production in which we are sitting in. But as we have very early works and we talked about each of the works already in this new production, I wanted to ask you about your beginnings and how you came to be an artist as well, which is a big question, obviously, but also where you were studying, what were your influences, and to begin with the beginnings, as one says. So.
Yes. I'm trying to kind of think if there was, for me, any way of being in the world, if not as an artist, and if there was any other possibility of any way of like, approaching the world than through art. And to be honest, I think art started maybe with my professor of philosophy at high school, who took us to the Museum of Modern Art in Paris, and that was like the first time I was seeing things that I was kind of asking a lot of questions to myself, like, what is this? What's going on? But I was really intrigued by those things, and I was really thinking, oh, I want to know what's happening here. I was curious, and I was driven, and I was like thinking there was something there for me to discover. And it was just like lemons on the floor, and yellow lemons and gray, but I was really super, super excited by them. And it was already a moment also of like thinking of ideas in relation to objects, or thoughts, of thinking in relation to objects and artwork. So through her thinking and her kind of teaching us philosophy, there was also then therefore a beginning of interest for art and associating philosophical questions with art making. So yeah, and from then on, I mean, at 19, I moved to London, and I started working with people. My partner then was into music, and he was involved with a company, a dance company. So then when I was 19, there were all these people around me that were doing dance and music in London, and London was a very dynamic place in the 90s that was very vibrant in terms of fashion, music. A lot was happening, British art, so we know, Steve McQueen, etc. So all these figures were like prominent. And I was at Goldsmiths, which also had this history of like producing a lot of these young British artists. So being in that art school at this time was a bit of a kind of super exciting moment of like, okay, what are we doing post young British art? Who are we? What can we bring? And very serious. There was a time where we were, as students, I think, taken very seriously, and that was really helpful to be kind of taken seriously as somebody young making things and talking about things. So I think that was a very important moment. Yeah.
Is this also, now I'm switching a bit, but Jimmy Robert is also professor at the Universität der Künste in Berlin. So is this something you carry now on as well to your students, this being serious? Because studying art is always a quest, and I see this quest still in your work, which you made kind of a concept. We might come back to this later. But it's a quest where you need reassurance as well, and that the questions you are asking are actually serious questions.
Yes, I mean, it's serious and also playful and pleasurable, and to kind of understand these various degrees of like being and making, and to kind of think that what you may do or bring out or put out in the world may matter or may be of interest for other people through a kind of engagement with them in a serious way. But when I say serious, I mean like thinking through things, and kind of trying to discourse and have a discourse around them also. So I think that's really important. So that's definitely something I would love my students to be able to do, or to feel like they can do also, a form of empowerment as well. Yeah.
Also asking questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe the notion of the quest in your work, there we can talk about certain elements you have, because once you came here to Kunsthalle Baden-Baden to produce a new work, you were actually questioning the architecture in your work. So you try to embrace it, you try to approach it, you took photos, you try to inhabit it in a way. So architecture in general, it's a very big element in your work. So how did this came that you saw how architecture, this influence of architecture in the daily life? Because we are just, we move, we climb up stairs, and we don't ask what are these stairs. And
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know anything about architecture, and I won't claim to do, but I think it's it's monumental, it's all around us, and we have to deal with it. And we have to enter it, we have to physically deal with it. And it has to deal with us. And, you know, there is this relation of like, maybe it's a kind of choreographic relation, maybe it's a kind of relation whereby you have to realize, okay, which part of my body do I need to move? What do I feel when I touch this wall? Do I fit in this space? Am I allowed to come into this space? Will the security keep me out of this space? You know, there are many questions of like negotiating this space in terms of like, how am I just being in this space? And just a kind of maybe over physical and emotional relation to spaces in general. And yeah. So it's not so much that I've always wanted to work with architecture, but it's always been a question of like, one, dealing with institution, what does it mean to bring my body into this particular institution? What is it doing as a performer, maybe? Maybe it's more this, it's more in terms of, in relation to dance, movement and performance and choreography that I think of spaces. And maybe we don't question so much when we go into the black box, into a theater. Okay, I'm in the theater, I do my work. And
on the stage.
Yeah, because it's the stage, and then you just put it in different stages. But then when you come into the museum, it's not like, oh, okay, I'm going to treat the museum as a stage, because the museum doesn't have this history, and therefore what do you then project onto it? What do I project onto it as an artist, but also what does it project back to me as a reflection? And so maybe it's more that in a way than architecture per se.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we are here now in a work or a spatial installation actually that makes us question where we are in, because it's enhancing, exaggerating, the space in a way. And in a work we see here as a video documentation, actually, imitation of lives. This already started to bring the visitor in a space where he doesn't know what's going on, or what is it, or how do I behave in the space actually. So
and this house is a museum as well. So am I allowed to touch the furniture? You know, am I allowed to sit on the bed and have a domestic experience in a place that is a museum? And that's definitely something I wanted to investigate in that particular performance. And I kept asking, can we touch the furniture? Can we sit on the bed? And so a lot of the movement that you see in the performance are about caressing the furniture in a way of almost like trying to relate to it, also because there is this sense of it's not something we are allowed to do normally in a museum.
Yeah, that's true. Tactility also, when you say that, navigating through the daily world we are experiencing, touching is something that's very apparent in your work. And you said this in context of the work Technique et Sentiment, for example. It's in one of the large rooms in the Kunsthalle, you have seen it, where you hear as a sound piece is added to the photographic series, where you hear Jimmy Robert stepping on paper, dancing and moving. So what is this tactility? Also in photos you see his hands, for example, very often so. And also the very early work, Brown Leatherette, your hand is on the floor. So
So I think to me there is a direct relation between seeing and touching. And I think it's almost as if blind, and as if saying like the gaze is not enough and touch is a way of enhancing the visual experience. Like, how do I know what I'm seeing is real? As by touching it, I have a sense of its physicality, of its objecthood. I know there's not a lot that is written about touch as a sense, and we know a lot about what it is not to see, what it is not to hear, but we don't know so much what it is not to feel and not to touch. And when somebody, you know, loses their hand, and they're kind of creating all this technology to understand like how touch is functioning, and it's this, you know, micro kind of electric kind of connections that are kind of providing this sense of touch. And also I feel as men, we're also very, very disconnected to our sense of touch. And that's something that I think that I would, that I'm very, very interested in also, with dissociation. I'm not generalizing, but I think there is, when you look at the science of touch, there are way more women involved in the science of touch than there are men. So this says a lot.
Yeah, it's caring also, I think. It's probably, it might be very traditional thinking, but being a mother, for example, who has to hold or carry a child in a way, which is really important.
Breastfeed.
Breastfeed. We know the history of, it has been researched that you can't live without touch or warmth or bodily.
And then as men, we're also told in a generalizing way that touching, is maybe too emotional. So we're kind of distancing ourselves from this notion of touch. And I think there is something there that is very, very important. Once you distance yourself to touch, then how do you relearn to touch and to care and to, a whole range of emotions.
If there are questions or if you want to add something to our conversation, please do so, because I feel now we are coming from this to touch, and it's a boat that sails. I don't know where it will sail, but if you want to join us, or I can also translate, please do so. Maybe to go back to the earlier years and your time in London, and often in your work you're referencing or cite various artists, and you try as well to come close to their art by doing the same thing as with Yvonne Rainer, for example, the performer. So how did this come about, that you revisit artists, their practice, their movement, for example? Because also getting to know someone might also be to move the same way, so I can get to know you. How are you thinking? So
Yeah, I think there's like two versions. There's the version which is learning by doing, which is something I strongly believe in terms of education and art, and it's not mimetism, it's actually, it's kind of trying to understand things by repeating them, just like maybe the way we learn language as kids. But there is also this other version, which I feel is very much like who holds visibility and power in the art history as we know it, and then how to kind of make work that has validity or that is seen as valid without having this history, to support you. And I feel that kind of almost devouring this history or kind of appropriating it is a way also of finding a place within it, because it feels like inventing, or before one is able to invent their own language, they need to kind of assimilate some others in a way, mostly in terms of art and the canons of Western art, and like who is visible, and who is not, and how does one then create a language from existing canons. Is really difficult without these references if you're not coming from the Western world somehow, in terms of the way visibility is distributed overall.
So it's also appropriating to fit in as well, to provoke.
Or to question also the idea of like how does one fit in? What does it mean to fit in? As it's who fits in.
Who fits in? So the.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for me, it's a big word. So it's like it does and it doesn't. For a long time, I was kind of going maybe against it and thinking more like of the body as an object. And I'm more closing to this, to getting outside of that and getting a kind of picture of myself as a subject. But that took a really long time. And it was a very long journey to kind of refuse to see the identity and to kind of build it up through art making and kind of and encounters and discussions with others, and yeah. So I think it's something that is still in the making, and that is changing, and that is fluid, and that is constantly like challenged also, I think. And but that's exciting also, that it means that there is not a fixed identity, and things are kind of, you're learning who you are constantly through art making, through encounters, through curators, directors, and family and boyfriends.
Thank you for the question. Candice, you had a question too?
Yeah, I wanted to think about what you're talking, what you're saying about cannibalizing and appropriating the Western canon, and just to test some of my projections onto the work, which may or may not be where you're coming from. But of course, if you trace that canon back all the way, it takes us back to Rome and Greece, and of course, architecture like this, to a large extent, is part of that lineage. And what I find so fascinating about the work is how your appropriation of it is not, it doesn't have a kind of bravado or a kind of sense of wanting to overcome it or beat it, despite the violence and the power that is embedded in that canon. But it feels almost as if there's an insistence on inserting yourself as a subject, somebody who was not welcome in that canon. At the same time, there's something really poignant and moving about how vulnerable you feel, despite how statuesque you are, and despite how serene your presence is in the architecture. There's still a kind of vulnerability. So you put yourself lying on the floor. It's not a kind of combative relationship. And yeah, I think maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like something which has to do with the word that I learned recently, kind of that has to do with this idea of soft power, or you know, how like you can make changes through, not with violence, but through actually constant, slow influence and change. And so there is obviously this dichotomy of this tear between how one is perceived and how one is, and how one is would like to be perceived, and so I think that comes a lot, you know, and I'm trying to maybe imbalance that or disturb that in a way. So there is this person that says, "You're a tall, black, strong man," and I'm like, "No, I'm not." Or sometimes I'm like, "Yes, I am." So you know, it's a kind of torn between these things, and kind of, okay, how then do I still, you know, make things within these perceptions and be true to like the reality, myself, the situation, the world we live in, and yeah.
I think that there's a quiet subversion to it, the position that you take, in the sense that unfortunately we still live in a racist culture where there's a kind of fear attached to black masculinity, right? And something about your refusal to perform that expectation, which I think is very profound and very subversive. But the things I wanted to taste, and then I'll shut up, was of course in your costume, which you made. For me, immediately took me to the Parthenon and the kind of fallen soldiers, which are also in some sense are images of male fragility, defeat. And I also couldn't help wondering, because I was in the fitness spot this morning, and there you also get the sheets
Around.
So I was wondering if you're taking a little cheeky stab at some of the local costumes, the local traditional costumes.
I think
We were thinking this too. I didn't say it though.
I mean, there is a picture in Friedrich Bad where you see someone wrapped up in this neoclassical, and I think we showed it to Matt, and he said, "Oh, that's your work." Yeah. But there is definitely, and I mean, most recently the work in Napoli. You know,
Yes.
when I was looking at this And I think that's also, everything is influencing each other, and so you don't just go from one work to the next, but there is always this thread. And I was looking at how it was called the myth of the white Greece, and it was looking at how a lot of classical Greek sculptures had lost their color through time, and they were all super colorful, but then we just see them as white and monochromatic, and that was used as a kind of argument for purity and whiteness and everything like that, and then some scientists started to get this color back, and it was just like some blonde and blue eyes, but there was still color and pink cheeks and red lips and etc. Super colorful outfits, and how this kind of put back into question our perception or construction of the world as it is, and art history. And it's really interesting. So I went then to Napoli, to the museum, the archaeological museum in Napoli, and then also Pompeii, and then started looking also at all these kind of bronze sculptures, that are essentially black, and then also some without eyes, or they were all like, there's this one called the Barbarians that very conveniently is black marble, the body and the face are made of black marble, and I was like, okay, what's happening there? So it's kind of started thinking of this already then, within this construction of history. And then, of course, coming here, this neo or classicism or neoclassicism is something we were also talking about, Bridgerton and promenading, and these various constructions of history and how they can just be shifted, also. And it's, again, something that is kind of fascinating and playful, and that you can play with. I think there's a lot of material to kind of have also fun there, and enjoy and kind of subvert, and so, but it's an interesting moment to do this also, I think, to kind of, okay, can we start asking questions about this history, and what then comes out on the other end of this discussion, and do we think then differently, or do we hierarchize things differently?
Yeah, especially to add to your question, you in the new series you are actually playing with that, with our perception of the marble as being uncolored or white. That's how the past art history looked, and you put yourself almost sculpture-like on the marble as if it would be a pedestal. I think it's a very courageous gesture to do, because it can be cheeky, but it's also not if you think about it. And these back and forth, these changing moments do appear a lot in your work. As if we go back to Imitations of Life and the museum, Philip Johnson Glasshouse, the performance, where you constantly change to be perceived as someone else. This reflects back to the visitors who might have thought you were just, I'm saying just, but the security person, but then you become the performer. So this is constantly reflected back. You can see this here in the room where we are actually reflected. Yeah.
Also the intruder. I think in Imitation of Life there is also this question of the intruder, the person who's not supposed to be there, or is coming to rob, or is coming, it's like, and when we talked about this neighborhood in Connecticut, which has absolutely no black people in it. So it's like, you can, unless the waiters, so there is then this class issue also then that is associated with the body and how the body is perceived. So doing that performance in this house, there was a lot of things to kind of think about, and it was at the time of the Black Lives Matter protest and the police murders, and so there was a lot to think about then in terms of how a body is perceived within a certain space, and whether it's allowed to be there, and to take this space also. And so I think that doing this work was an opportunity to reflect and take that space, appropriate it, just like appropriating this art history, historical canons, and
Also, who can take a certain space and who gets assigned a space is, I think, also a question. Where can you move, or where can you actually be? And this brings me to a question, and maybe Adnan can add to this as well, about dressing, the codes we are sending, because your work has both. your body through performance, dance, but you're always dressed in a certain way. And our title is All Dressed Up and Nowhere to Go. So dressing is something, how do I want to be perceived, or if I think about it. So can you say something
about
that?
Do you want to say something?
19th century feeling of the park, that like Nevsky Boulevard, people go outside, show their outfits. We live in such a park. I think being seen and perceived is part of modernity. So, but I will keep my question for the quiz space.
Okay, good. It's fine. We just discussed about it with my
But maybe
colleague.
they go together. I think this thing about dressing that came up from like maybe just living in London in the 90s and how like when you live in London more than anywhere else, I don't know, maybe that's to be verified, but that's, as a young person, I've felt that you are read from head to toe. And people say, oh, because you wear this, you're belonging to this class. Or because you wear these shoes, you're listening to this kind of music, and because of your hair, then maybe you are listening to this other kind of music, and then you're this, so there is a whole code, a whole language that adding different elements, you are kind of producing an image, and you're producing a lecture of yourself through what you're wearing. And then you can also challenge this. And I thought that was always really playful in London, and at art school I was wearing suits and, kind of, but already there's my friend from art school, she could tell you, I was always playing with things, wearing African fabric and being gothic and, mix and matching these different codes to create something that is hybrid and that is more about enjoying different forms than saying there is one prioritized over another. And so taking pleasure in kind of mixing these forms and mixing these identities that we were talking about and challenging that reading.
We also spoke about it, there's a movement in fashion at the moment where certain codes are kind of dissolved and streetwear, or let's say people are wearing clothes on the catwalk that wouldn't have been there before, and they are just branded, Balenciaga, for example.
Yeah.
Do you think about that too? About these?
Not so much. Okay. No, but not as much. There used to be a time when I would have thought about this a lot, and I was much more invested in it, but now a little bit less. And I see also this trajectory where Balenciaga is coming from, Margiela. I'm much more interested in Margiela than Balenciaga.
Yeah,
and how they were recycling clothes and doing things out of nothing and giving. I thought that was to me much more empowering. That you would go to the second-hand shop and then yourself you would kind of be creative. And I made jackets in the style of Margiela, and because I really thought there was something fun there, and it was not about money. It was not about status. And then this whole play with status and for me it's then more problematic, and it's just I'm not so interested in it. I think I'm more interested in the kind of the creativity and the challenge of making something that is also creating beauty out of nothing, or a complex, or simplicity or somehow. But there is a whole discussion there to be had that I think it's interesting, but I don't know if I'm so invested into it, particularly in relation to Balenciaga.
Okay.
I have,
No? Yeah. Another question that relates to movement and fashion is, you also, in one of your performances before, you are wearing paper or even metal. And so there's, you kind of hinder yourself to move. I haven't seen it in real, but you're actually wearing paper as well. So how did this come about?
I think it comes from that same interest, for fashion that I was talking about, in terms of but it comes also with this idea of porosity and touch and proximity, materials, and I mean the metal. This is the only object in metal, I think maybe one of the two objects in metal that I've made, Metallica, which is this skirt, which is impossible to move around, and so it's blocking the body, and it's more about how can the body relate to an object that is not made for it, so that it cannot be worn. And paper is porous, so paper has this porosity, this lightness, can be touched, and it's a very interesting surface to kind of make images on, to write on, but also to wear. So why not, try all these limits, stretch the limits of what we can think of and do with a certain material.
Sandeep has a question, a comment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, do you perceive those codes also as something heaviness, as a weight on you, as an artist, as an individual, in a closed system?
Yes, I guess. I don't know. I haven't kind of really answered where that nowhere to go is. And so I kind of leave it up there, up in the air, in terms of like what this may mean as a possible metaphor or like a feeling or so I feel there's a kind of weight, but there's also a lightness. It's up to you also how you deal with it, right? And so there are different like strategies, and you could, as I said before, like challenge them, and maybe in the challenge they become lighter, not so much of a weight, but something that you can play with, and therefore lighter, or take pleasure in, and enjoyment, which also takes its time, I think, to kind of, it's like this thing about seriousness I was talking about, and being taken seriously and seriousness, and they're like very different things.
Yeah.
I'm going to take, via my question, the conversation to a bit to the form, because you are, I would say, really incredibly combining very different forms, spoken or written word, which is very poetic, the lyrics, and then the form photography, which is kind of your ongoing research, what remains after the performance, what is the performance, is it the moving body and the image and the gaze, and if the body has to be present. So I think it would be interesting to ask you, this, there is only the audience. Now we are stakeholder, and as the artist you are part of it now, but mainly the audience is the performer in herself. So how is going to continue from maybe here? What do you think? Like, what is the moment of your idea now?
What's happening? I don't know. I guess maybe we're coming more and more, or I am coming more and more to a point where I'm kind of a bit like, okay, I'm tired of seeing myself. I want to see you. I want to see you perform. You do the job. So I think it's roughly put, I would like to, because it's always been about this gaze and the perception and reversing that perception, and I want to know more how people themselves have build up these perceptions, experience themselves, perform or don't perform. And it doesn't mean making things that are interactive suddenly, everybody performs, but really shifting that gaze and like find strategic ways of shifting that gaze. And I don't know exactly what that's going to be, but yeah, it's finding ways of like working with that.
Maybe we can add the queer, because maybe 20 years later, 30 years later, this might become a nostalgic term. You see how gender becomes so fluid with new generations. But in your work, I really acknowledge that it's poetical, and it's not a term, it's not a thema, it's not a concept. It's a lens, it's a perspective, it's a reality. And especially with general idea reference, beautiful staging in number 5, the drag queen that empowers us, or we have a free offer for the audience. We welcome people with a video about cruising. It fits very much to the surrounding. Your 20 years of working also is a witness of how we change as body and how we represent ourselves. And you witness yourself how this term became institutionalized, part of cultural studies, and now became part of our pop culture from the new words to the earlier we can read with the dirt and the soaps, everything. What is queer for you? How did you deal with it in the whole time? It's a very heavy question, I know. But even these mirrors, the ribbons, everything in your work is so poetical and queer, but doesn't really have this representation anxiety. It is so poetical.
What is the question?
It doesn't look like any other artist I know
Okay.
of your generation.
I don't know if I feel so consciously about that. I mean, it's like earlier I was thinking when Candice was talking about this book, you know, Black Male, from this exhibition at the Whitney, and then how influential that was in terms of like, okay, like consuming everything that had to do with representation in the 90s and like in the US also, because, you know, it was different in Europe and it was just like, there was no discourse, no representation, and it was like, starving, you know, and wanting to know what discussion can be had. And so I think that sometimes in the absence of a discussion, you have to create it yourself or create like the space like yourself. So maybe it's more of this kind of patchwork of like Euro-American kind of, etc. Kind of what, again, come back to the Western kind of world, because that's all, you know, they seem to be accessible. And I think now we have a wider spectrum, maybe because of the internet, let's say. But so there is a construction that is much more layered and much more complex. But then again, I don't know, because you see places where now they're removing queer studies out of the spectrum. So I don't know if this is so stable, you know. So how long are we having it for? Because in a lot of countries, things are changing. So I'm not so strongly feeling about, you know, everything that I or some of us stand for and how stable they are and for how long. You know, Judith Butler becoming out of the curatorial or teaching programs at university. I think this is really alarming, very, very scary. So, yeah.
So you mentioned the gays, so I can't help wanting to hear more about your. I don't think it's about blindness, but you've denied yourself the possibility of looking back, which I think is very interesting in terms of what you and I are talking about, because I think over the last 15, 20 years, a lot of the discourse around what it means to broaden the range of people who are welcome in these creative spaces has been about looking back and taking the gaze back and turning around the kind of ethnographic systems. And I find it so interesting and so Jimmy that you would deny yourself that it's not a denial. I'm just very curious to hear you talk about that decision. I mean, I read it certainly as also on some level a reference to the classical tradition, and on the eyes are not there. But what else was going through your head when you made that decision?
Ghostliness, you know, death, the museum as death. Is the museum there to pursue, to continue things, or is it an end? Is it the end of everything? And mostly in terms of performance and liveness. You know, okay, some museums are acquiring live art or live work, but there is this sense also like, and I saw this mostly through my friend Ian, he was very fascinated with this idea of death, and we made a lot of work around it. And he made a whole series of like how he was seeing the museum as this kind of end point. It's not the beginning, but it's the end of a conversation. Things are under glass, they're protected, works you cannot touch anymore, that were once, you know, interactive. And so on one hand, I'm not saying this is totally adhere to that, but there is something there to kind of think about. And then also this idea of possession. I had sent you this video when we started working on this film Possession with Isabella Gianni in New York, in Berlin of the 80s, and this idea of the body being taken over by another force, and like through like voodoo culture, Caribbean culture, and being, what does it mean to be possessed, and who is possessing you? Are you possessing the museum also? Because it's a back and forth. So who's possessing whom? And so there was this sense of like, and then also kind of refusal maybe also, and maybe also debasing that power, because then if you're facing, you're very kind of looking back at the camera and you're like, oh yeah, this person is in power, and then you're looking back at the camera. But if the gaze is empty, it's then like, who's then looking and who's looking back? And
considering the kind of role that the gaze play, the violence role that the gaze play, there's something interesting about not re-instrumentalizing that in the works, not using the master's tools to try to deconstruct the house.
No, Audre Lorde is a very important figure, I think, in terms of subtext that I've been trying. Well, I've made the students read as soon as we started to really think of these notions of power, what it is, the professor and the students, this relation, and so to kind of, which is something I'm really struggling with, and I think to learn art, it's really kind of an exchange, and it's not like we're here to learn from each other, and I see that people are kind of having this, waiting for this knowledge to be passed on, and I'm like, oh, so it's a source of anxiety also, and so I think this author for me offered a lot of ways to think of these notions of like power and challenging them, in a very interesting way.
I wanted to come back maybe as a final words, because we are talking an hour. This was our maximum for post-opening talks in a way. But please feel welcome to ask questions. But I think if you just talked about death and museums, and I strongly feel or think that exhibitions like this, it might now be an end for our weekend. But I think I see in your work very strongly that there's no death, that questions and topic are still being discussed and that it goes on. So the conversation
not over.
Should not end. And I think this is one of the strengths in your work. That these,
Thank you.
So thank you as well. Thank you. It's not over. There we go again. But we see each other hopefully in a month almost at the weekend of 26th. 26th November, 26th of November, where Jimmy Robert comes with his students back to Kunsthalle to have a performance weekend and to perform within the space. And we are really looking forward to host all of you again.
Thank you. Looking forward.